Hangout. I'm Dr. Whitaker, as you know, and I really appreciate all the questions that you've submitted, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. Okay, first of all, I have a question from Aaron. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but I think it's Aaron, or maybe it's Arun. Anyway, Aaron asks, what changes or actions can men make or take in their daily lives to help reduce gender inequality in society? That's a really big question, right? I can tell you what sociologists would say about that. Social theorists, in particular feminist theorists, would point out that gender inequality is institutionalized, right? It's a part of the social structure of many different societies, including American society. And one element, for example, of society, religious faiths, to a greater or lesser degree historically, just to give a specific example, have prescribed specific guidelines for men's and women's roles within marriages, within families, the workplace, politics, government, and in the general society. But there are all types of societal traditions, and these traditions carry with them a certain amount of inertia. Once inequality is embedded in a culture, it's very hard to uproot. I think part of the problem is, for most citizens in a given society, they are just trying to get through their everyday lives and survive the challenges that they face personally, or as a member of a relationship or a family, or as an employee, and so on. And it takes a lot of energy to organize and mobilize a grassroots initiative to try to bring about some type of social change. So as far as what you as an individual, or men as individuals, can do in their daily lives, my suggestion, and I talk to my students about this all the time in my in-person classes, is you need to look at people who are different than you, and men, or women, or have some differences. I think men should look at women with fresh eyes, and not in terms of prescribed cultural roles or traditions, but look at them as individuals who have intelligence and creativity and wit and wisdom to bring to the culture, to daily life. And don't think of them within certain limitations. Don't try to limit what they can contribute to society. I hope that answers your question to some degree. Obviously, that is a hard nut to crack, as we say, because it's been going on forever and nobody's thoroughly resolved it yet. So I hope my suggestions have been helpful to you. Aaron, you also asked me, why is there a rape culture in developed countries? And you asked, especially in the United States, is it the case that development is not the answer to all social evils? Well, in the short version is, yes, that's right. It's not the answer to all social evils. I think whether you're talking about economic development, or industrial development, or technological development, and so on, those types of development, either alone or together, do not necessarily change women's attitudes toward men, regardless of what type of society you're talking about. We here in the United States, we have a history of sexism and misogyny that historically has been institutionalized in our culture. Feminist theory would point out that women have been treated as objects historically, and have been limited in our society, in our culture, to performing subordinate level roles. For example, historically, women were not allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to vote in this country, and so on. in regard to rape per se and a rape culture, I'm sure you know that rape is about power. It's not about sex, right? I'll talk about some of my personal work experience for a minute. You may or may not know that prior to getting into education, I worked for many years as an adult probation officer, and I did such things as supervise adult offenders who had committed all manner of crimes. And I also, in some cases, for half of my time as a probation officer, I did background investigations of men and women who still had yet to be sentenced for the crimes they committed. They had pled guilty or been found guilty via a trial, but they were still awaiting sentencing. And my job was to prepare a report for the judge to explain the individual's background, what they had to say about what they did, their work history, their criminal record, if they had committed any prior offenses, their current attitude. I had to talk to the victims of crimes and get, what a statement from them about what they wanted to see happen to the person who had committed the crime against them. I had to talk to police officers and lawyers who were both prosecuting the case and representing the offender. And so I interacted for years with all these different types of people. And you had said that you had read an article in Time magazine saying that the blame for rape is always put on the woman. And I'm happy to say, at least in this jurisdiction where I worked for many years, that was not the case. The police and the courts did not automatically blame the victim. There within police departments, within the courts, there are very aggressive, assertive program in place to help victims with the resources, the counseling, and so on that they need to advocate for them in court for a just sentence that gives the victim justice also. And at least here where I live, I would say no one thinks that it's the woman's fault. I think we are very advanced in that regard. When I was a probation officer, some of the offenders I had to work with were rapists, what I would call career rapists. They had a long history of it. This was what they did. And it was ghastly to have to talk to them and hear them relate in a very matter-of-fact way what they did and how they liked doing it, and they didn't see anything wrong with it, and they do it again, and they liked it, and they didn't have any empathy for the victim. And these were some really, I have to say, the ones who I dealt with face-to-face, interacted with for a few hours probably to prepare my report. These are really some scary, messed up guys, and they were all guys. I'm sure there are women who engage in sexual assault, but I would say, guess few and far between. Most of these types of offenders this type of offender is men. And, at the same time, most men obviously are not like these guys, right? I think the key to dismantling what you referred to as the rape culture and eliminating misogyny and sexism in our culture is education of the public. Starting in the schools, starting in in elementary school, to educate boys and girls about respect for all people of all traditions and all, both genders and anybody transgender in between and so on. And also communication. I think people with various different views need to get together and talk, however difficult it may be. I think without dialogue, without communication, we're never going to really change anybody's attitude. I think people have to be free to share what they feel and what they think, and also need to listen to other people. So Erin, I hope that was helpful, and I hope I addressed your question in a satisfactory way. These are big questions that you asked, and there aren't really any easy answers. Yeah. Probably you won't have any other teachers who say they actually got to know some rapists, but I did. Then next, I got a question from Francisco. Hi, Francisco. You asked for my suggestions about how to communicate to others in your line of work, and I believe you're a minister, because you mentioned talking to people from the pulpit. How you wanted to know how to communicate, I guess, to your congregation that it's important to accept people and respect the way of life that they've chosen, and also to respect their choices about who they love. And I'm guessing there has been some discussion amongst your members of your congregation about gay marriage or something along those lines, and people having expressed finding that idea difficult to accept, or maybe that they're finding homosexuality or transgender persons' way of life difficult to accept. I'm not sure, but I'm guessing it was something in that area that you were seeking to know from me how best to talk about that to your congregation. You said in your question, you used the phrase universal regulations regarding how people live and how they love. And I'm frankly not sure what you mean by universal regulations. And that's because I, as a sociologist, I'm an interactionist, and more specifically, I'm a phenomenologist. What that means is that my beliefs that I believe the values people have and the norms, the rules of conduct they live by, and their beliefs and so on are all socially constructed. I believe all of that is socially constructed, okay? So in my own view as a sociologist, there are no absolute rights or wrongs. There are only social constructions which are made of agreements between persons about how people should live and what's good and right and appropriate and what is bad and wrong and inappropriate. And I also am somewhat a believer in the pieces of conflict theory, which note that it's usually the people who have power in the society from whatever basis who are able to get their own definitions and their own priorities and their own values established for the whole community or the whole society as the way people should live. And so I think some people who have the power to get their own ideas about how things should go made the rule of the day for everybody else. So I think historically in some societies, church officials have been some of those powerful people who have made certain rules that dictated how people should live. And of course, government officials and so on, business leaders who are very powerful, who've got a lot of money and so on. So I think a lot of officials, they got laws made and had the ability to enforce them, establish them and enforce them. And the citizens then had to submit to those prescriptions. However, as a phenomenologist, as an interactionist, I don't believe in absolute truths. As I said, I think everything is socially constructed. And so perhaps I don't know that I'm really competent to advise you what to say from the pulpit. However, since you asked for my suggestions, my first suggestion would be that you advocate a live and let live philosophy when you speak to your congregation. The other thing, I'm a very big believer in a concept, a phenomenon that we covered early in this course, which pertained to the contact hypothesis, and it is part of um, a set of concepts developed by sociologists to talk about how to dismantle prejudices and how to dismantle discrimination. And the contact hypothesis, as you might recall, says that when you put two people together who have prejudices against each other, put them together and cause them or motivate them or persuade them to work together over time in a cooperative way. And in the case of your congregation members, it might be just getting people to sit down and talk to each other and continue the dialogue over time. What happens is when two people who are prejudiced against each other get to know each other as individuals rather than just representatives of a certain stereotype, what happens is each person comes to realize the breadth of the individual qualities that the other person has. They come to appreciate those, and that prejudice tends to break down. One person will say of the other, regarding whom he or she has held prejudices, this is a worthwhile person. This is a nice person. I like him or her. And so those prejudices start to break down. And so I'm thinking maybe having members of your congregation who are finding it hard to accept some other members' ways of life or their choices for partners and so on. Maybe get those people together in small groups and have them meet and talk over time, and maybe work on some projects. If your group does community service, have them work on projects together, community service projects, something that would allow them to work together and get to know each other as individuals. I think that would go a long way to starting the process of getting people to appreciate the diversity that is in, I'm sure, your congregation, and help to sort of break down those prejudices. So I hope that was helpful to you, Francisco. Then I got a question from I don't know if this is your name or if this is your role in the family, but a person who identifies as Nana. Hi, Nana. You asked me how sociologists would view corruption in society, and I think that a sociologist's views on corruption would, as I mentioned in other questions about other issues, would depend on which theoretical perspective he or she tends to use in his work or her work. For me, the conflict perspective and the interactionist perspective are both useful for making sense of corruption. The conflict perspective would say that people who have power in the society enjoy it, right? And they want to hang on to it. Sociologists talk about a phenomenon called the iron law of oligarchy. The iron law of oligarchy says just that people who get into power try hard to keep that power and tend to get entrenched. And they enjoy the perks that go with their offices, and they don't want to lose them. So they do what they can. For example, government officials will try to keep getting elected over and over again, and so on. Then the interactionist perspective would point out exactly what you talked about in the body of your question, that by many members' views in society, corruption has been defined through social interaction as a privilege or as a perk, right? So a lot of people in society, from what you described, a lot of people in your culture see corruption as just a means to getting certain privileges that you wouldn't have otherwise. So then you asked me, what can people like you do to eliminate corruption? Well, that's a tall order, right? That's a really big enterprise trying to eliminate corruption, because I, I personally feel that in all political systems there's some degree of corruption, or certainly of co-optation, and so on. So that's a big that's a big question, that's going to require a huge effort, right? No one's been able to do it yet, so it's quite an undertaking. But I have to say, I think it would be very difficult to bring about that type of social change. I think it would be very difficult to eliminate corruption, simply because, as I said, people who've got their power and they've got their perks, they tend to like to keep it, and they do everything they can think of to continue to enjoy those statuses, right? I think what you would need to do is to communicate with other people who you know in your community, and establish relationships with people you meet who you feel share your belief that change is needed. I think that's the first thing you have to do, is start talking to people, find identify people who have shared the belief with you that this is too much and something needs to change, and who are willing to try to join with you to work toward change. I think once you get a certain number of people identified who share your view of the need for change and think we just can't wait any longer, we need to do something, I think the people you have met and identified as sharing your views need to form a group and get together face to face and talk. You can also use social media to try to get new group members, to recruit additional people to join your group. But I think you need to meet together face to face and form. If you talk face to face in a room where where other people are right there, it tends to help form those bonds between people more readily than if you're just using social media. It helps with getting people to make commitments and stick to them if you have that direct link to other people. So I would recommend, as I said, meeting face to face and deciding what actions to take. And as I'm suggesting these things, please understand that I'm not familiar with your country's policies, and I'm not sure what types of activity on the part of citizens what types of activities are possible. So anyway, I just wanted to say, I hope, that I understand that maybe you can't engage in all of the things that I'm going to suggest here. I would say once you get your group formed, you need to develop a hierarchy of authority, who's going to be the group leader, who's going to be a community spokesperson for the group, in terms of if you're going to talk to people in the media or government officials or whatever. So you need to maybe have somebody in charge of recruiting additional members, somebody in charge of obtaining resources from groups in the community, whether it's money to help finance your activities or other types of resources. So then once you develop your division of labor, you want to get the members who are charged with doing these things to meet with government officials and express your concerns. You might want to, urge those officials to draft legislation that could be voted on in the next election that would help eliminate corruption, do something, penalties for corruption, or that might be implemented or something, or maybe just maybe if you could draft measures to limit the number of terms a politician could be in office. So you would limit the amount of time that any one person in office could enjoy, the benefits of whatever corruption he or she is involved in. You could also stage a public event, like I don't know about a protest or a demonstration, but some kind of public town hall meeting where group members would explain to their audience, members of your group would explain to their audience what type of concerns you have, the type of change you're advocating, and then interact one-on-one with, go out into the audience and interact one-on-one with audience members. Find people who share your views, and hopefully you can recruit additional, as in addition to just getting out your message, you could recruit additional members to your group that way. Then when there are elections in your area, you want to be sure to vote in the elections. Maybe you could even have someone from your group run for a local office to try to be part of the change from within the local government setting, right? And then I would say also, I think I mentioned this before, but try to get community members and organizations to donate money to help you do your work involved in trying to bring about change, to pay for the resources that your group would need, maybe to buy time on local television stations to get your message out to viewers, and so on. Okay, so I hope that some of these suggestions have been helpful to you, and that you are able to use this. I hope I've given you some stuff you can use. Okay, and then finally, have one more question. This is from Lydia. Hi, Lydia. All right. You asked me how each sociologist decides which perspective he or she will use to make sense of what's going on in the world. Whether, how do we become functionalists or conflict theorists or interactionists or feminists or whatever theoretical perspective we end up sort of buying into. The way you worded your question, by the way, cracked me up. I think, speaking personally, I became an interactionist probably because ever since I was a little kid, I've always been fascinated by face-to-face interaction, in particular nonverbal communication. I've always been a people watcher. Excuse me, just a second. I've always, noticed people's gestures and facial expressions and so on. And so for me, it was just kind of a natural to get into being an interactionist. Excuse me one more time. All right. I think also the point in history at which someone is going through college and is getting interested, taking social courses and deciding what makes sense to him or her as the theoretical perspective that seems to make sense of the world to the greatest degree. It also has to do with the point in history when the person is in school and formulating his or her own ideas. So back in the 40s is when functionalism, for example, was what you could say born, created by Talcott, a real famous sociologist named Talcott Parsons, and others, Robert Merton, and so on. And at that point in history, it seemed to make the ideas posited by functionalism made a lot of sense. But, our society, American society, has become a lot more diverse since the 1940s. I mean, it's always been pretty diverse, but it just keeps getting more and more diverse, and a lot of change has taken place, and functionalism sort of fell out of favor because functionalism really didn't have a way to explain social change, and at least not a good way. They tried to sort of revise it over time to account for change, but there was really never, in my view, it never really they were never able to modify it so that it was adequate for explaining social change. And we've got, my gosh, every day something's different, so I think it sort of fell out of favor because it was a more static view of society, where it's plain to everybody that society is not at all static these days, not any societies around the world. I think also one's personal beliefs and values and life experiences affect which theoretical perspective a sociologist ultimately adopts as his or her guiding perspective. Like I said, I'm believe in I tend to be an interactionist when we're talking about micro level daily life stuff, and I'm more of a when I'm more looking on the macro level, I'm more into conflict theory. So probably also depends on the level of society that a sociologist chooses to look at and chooses to study in his or her research. Right. And then I think current events also affect how a sociologist chooses what perspective works for them at any given time. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. I think for me, as I said, I think I was just an inveterate people watcher. And um, then another student asked me how to be a change agent, how to effect social change, and how to be effective in that role. And I really think that we citizens as people, we have busy lives. I'm sure many of you feel, as I sometimes feel, that you're just running from one obligation to another, and you don't really have time to get involved in a social movement or so on. I would say, by all means, vote. Register to vote and make your voice heard in every election that comes around in your area. If you are an American student, if you're in the United States at this time, and I would say be sure register to vote in this presidential election that's coming up. It's going to be a very consequential election. It'll whoever is elected, whichever presidential candidate is elected, it will make a big difference in what direction the country takes going forward in time. So I would say vote for sure. And that's probably, other than voting, if you have time to get involved in any grassroots movements that are in place, or start your own, going through sort of the steps that I outlined earlier for Nana, in terms of when I was making suggestions to her about how to work against or eliminate corruption in society. I would say if you have a chance to get involved in any such social movements that are groups of people trying to effect some type of social change, I urge you to do that. I personally try to do volunteer work whenever I can. As you know, for this course, we went and interviewed some people who run a homeless shelter here in the area where I live. I've since gotten more involved with them, and I'm having my students in my in-person classes. They're not required to, but they are very willingly donating clothes and small household items for the shelter and for the residents of the shelter. And we're doing several collections. So I would say in any way you can get involved to help improve the quality of life in general for members of your community, in whatever way makes sense to you, just to feel like you're part of a solution. That I think that's a really great contribution that you can make. We have an organization here also in the United States called Habitat for Humanity. Get together and build houses for people who cannot afford to buy a house. And those people also participate in the building of their house, and they pay something, but they pay a reduced amount for what a house would normally cost in the areas, in the local area here, for example. And if you can get involved in if you have a spare weekend day to work in some type of community service project, whether it's building houses or cleaning up a neighborhood or working with kids, after school programs or whatever you might have time to do, I would say just find a way that makes sense to you, that fits into your schedule, to be a part of the solution and to be part of a way to improve the quality of life for members of your society who are disadvantaged in some way. So thank you very much for tuning in. You've been a great class. I've really enjoyed talking to you all through the course platform, and I wish you the best on the final exam and in your lives, and hope to see you again sometime in a future course. Bye bye.